Dr. Karl Neuman. He's a retired pediatrician from New York and the proud grandfather of Alex Neuman, who's here with us today. He's been gracious enough to come here to share his story and his experiences during the Holocaust as a child. He survived the major atrocities of the war. His story has been told many times. There is a documentary on him from Immigration New York, and his story has been told in many public engagements throughout the years. So we are very thankful that you're here with us today. And
okay. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. It's really a pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, we're not talking about a very happy subject. I often give humorous talks, but that's not going to be the case today. We're going to talk about my life and how I went through it and how I survived. I'm here. That's proof I survived. And I was born in 1931, so to save you the trouble of figuring out how old I am, I'll tell you. So I'm going to be 87 tomorrow. I was born in Vienna, Austria, Jewish family. We were Jewish, and here people always know where they came from, but they had lived there forever, all through the ages. And a lot of people think that all the Jewish people are wealthy. Well, I can vouch for that. We were not. My father was a doctor, but in those days, doctors were a little different than they are today, because today I think most do well. So we actually lived in a subsidized housing area of Vienna. And my father was a physician, and he was paid for by the city. And we had an apartment over a grocery store, and half of the apartment was over a street. It was a row of houses, and the street went underneath my bedroom. I always was afraid I'd fall through one day when the whole thing would collapse. And the apartment was small. Our living room was also the waiting room for the office. Well, the waiting room for the office was our living room. So all I was, what did I say was I introduced myself, Karl Neuman, 87 years old, from Vienna, Jewish, and I was telling them how we lived, not in the lap of luxury, but that's how it was. And we had lived there in Vienna for forever. And I'm going to give you a little background for the Holocaust before I get to my part of it. And we're going to show the first slide. And there's only a couple of slides to read, actually only two, so don't worry about that. So this is me. That's my picture. That's my sister's picture. This was, I was about 4 or 5, and she was a little younger. And you can notice the swastika on the stamp here, and also the J. That meant you were Jewish. Could you show the next slide? There are 2 slides I want you to read because that sort of gives you what we're talking about. The Holocaust was a systematic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. So that's one slide. And the other slide, to give you just the background to this, the Nazis who came to power in Germany in January of 1933 believed that Germans were racially superior and that the Jews deemed inferior were a threat to the so-called German racial community. I'll have a little more to say about that later. And then we have a picture here of 4 children on the side. That's me and my sister. And on the other side are my cousins, who were about the same age. And we'll show you a picture later of the ski, which has nothing to do with now. So what happened? The Holocaust probably started in 1914, 1918, World War, terrible war. And actually, this week, they commemorated the end of the war 100 years ago. President Trump went there, and the leaders of all the other countries went there too. And it was a terrible war. It lasted 4 years, and about 20 million people died. Many died as an act of the war, others died of starvation, because everything went to pot. And at the end of the war, there was chaos all over Europe. And the worst country involved was Germany, where everything went to pot. They had no economy, money was worthless. People had to go and buy a loaf of bread with a barrel full of money, cost like 1,000,000 marks, which was their money form. There were no jobs, there was hunger. The country was devastated. And also, there was a lot of humiliation. Germany had been one of the major countries, one of the most advanced countries at the time. But everything went bad, and from bad it went to worse. And what happened is that a lot of people looked for new ways to set up the country over again. Also, I should say, 32 countries were involved in this war. Some of these were little countries, some were big ones. And they all had treaties that said if one was attacked, the others would come to the rescue. And it was almost a joke, a very bad joke, that all these countries got involved. And you really needed at times a scorecard to know who was fighting who. My father was in the army, he was in the Austrian army, and he was fighting Italy. This was before my time. And he really said he never knew why he was fighting Italy, but they could have sent him to fight Russia, or to fight Britain, or fight anybody, the US. The US got involved in the war. So that was the war that started things. And to straighten out what had happened in Germany, different people tried to make things better. And one of the persons who tried this was named Adolf Hitler. And eventually, the governments that tried to form and reform things and make things better, they all failed, more or less, until Hitler came along in the middle 20s. And he believed, and we have it, he was the one who started these racial laws. He believed that the Germans were a super race, and they can do it. And he believed that they were superior. And I want to read you, just to have it accurate, what he said. Destroy the weak to provide the proper space and purity for the strong. And he strongly believed this, and he wrote it. He wrote a book. He said exactly what he was going to do. I think one thing that many people don't get is that it didn't only, and the Jews were to blame for everything. They were blamed for the war, the chaos, and there was really no thread of evidence that this was so. The Jews fought in their country, and the 32 countries, most of them had Jews in them, and they fought like everyone else, and there was really no problem with that. But this caught on. It caught on because there was a history of discrimination against the Jews over the ages for various reasons, and reasons we don't have the time to really go into. So he made that the central part of his program. But what I was going to say is that while the Jews are the main characters in this coming Holocaust, other people were involved. He had a strata of what people were like. The Jews were the worst. Then there were the people of Eastern Europe, who he wasn't going to kill, but he was going to make them serfs, which in the Middle Ages was like slavery. These people worked on big estates of the rich people, and they were going to go. And they did go, and they did get killed also. But the main thrust was against the Jews. He also thought that people with mental handicaps or physical handicaps were not worthy of this new race that he was going to develop. And people with handicaps were murdered, like all these other people. So this is what set loose. He came to power in the mid-20s, and by the time 1933 came about, Hitler was the leader of Europe. They called him the Führer. That means the leader. and he was an absolute dictator. Laws had gone by, nobody could say anything. Helping Jews meant that you would die. Many other people died who were not Jewish, but again, the thrust was on the Jews. My father lost the apartment and the office because he was Jewish. Some of the people from the area, the housing, which was part of the city there, came to him, to the authority, and said, we're going to lose our doctor. The answer was, he's Jewish, how can you not lose him? So taking care of the people was not important as long as they could get rid of someone who was Jewish. Lots and lots of priests were killed. At one of the concentration camps, they had a special section for priests. And as one priest said, and I read this, that if you kept your mouth shut as a Catholic, you were okay. But how do you keep your mouth shut when you see what's happening? Some people saved Jewish kids, and they did so at the risk of their lives. There's one story where they had a convent, and one morning there were 60 kids there that were not there before, and the German authorities found out about it. So they went there and talked to the leaders of the convent, and they told them it was a miracle. They did not know how they came. Obviously, they were Jewish kids, and in this convent, they got away with it because the Germans just didn't look. So these were not good times, but the times got worse. In 1938, in November, a lot of things happened in November. The Germans were ready to set loose their final solution, which was the elimination of all the Jews. And what they did, and this was the Nazi party, many Germans were Nazis, but lots of them were not. But the party was under direct control of Hitler. And one night in November, they decided to let loose with their destroying of the Jewish communities all over Germany. And what they did is they burnt synagogues, broke into houses, blamed the Jews for doing it, but the Jews were the victims. They were not doing it. And then when the people who had their houses burned want to get the money back from the government or whoever, the insurance company, they couldn't because they froze all the money that was going to go to the Jews anyway for their insurance. It's also the first time that I felt something. Now, by that time, I was about 8 years old, 7, 8. And the teacher in my school, who was not Jewish, called, I think, 4 or 5 kids who were into another room and sorry. She was crying. And she said this was the worst day of her life. She had to tell us, we can't come to we can't come to school anymore. And she handed us an envelope to give to our parents. But she was, that's when I realized teachers don't cry. Certainly not in front of their kids. She hugged us. She wished us good luck. And that was the end of schooling in Austria for me. Now, things got worse. They now started the concentration camps, which were called extermination centers. And they were set up all over the country. And, well, at that point, only in Germany. And that's where people went, one, if they were Jewish or if they said anything bad about the Hitler regime. They sent people in cattle cars. They packed them in. They had no, and some of the trips took several days. They had no food. They had no water. They had no toilet facilities. This was kids, and this was adults and old people. Many died on the train, on these various trains. The ones who got to the concentration camps, if they looked like they could work, they were taken in to work under terrible conditions. If they didn't look like they were able to work, they would be killed, usually in rooms with poison gas, and then were required to bury the ones who were dead. They were tattooed with a number. And one thing about the regime of the Nazis, they kept very good records. So this is not the record only of the victims. It's the records also of the survivors, that people who did survive. This was now in the late 30s. Then World War II started. And then the Germans, and the Nazis mostly, but the German army, started invading different countries in Europe. And at one time, they covered most of Europe. And they took these ways and their methods and their philosophy into these other countries. So then the Jewish population of Poland, where there were like 3 million Jews, and in other countries, and they went into every town and city and village to find the Jews and to kill them. And they did. My father was, as I said, had been in the Austrian army, and a lot of people really up to this point didn't accept what was going on and thought that that Hitler was a crackpot and wouldn't last very long. And many people stayed on, the ones who could get out of the country. And now it wasn't only Germany, it was all of Europe, because Germany controlled the country, the other country. And things at the concentration camps got even worse. More people were starved, more were killed. Some were used for medical experiments. And as I was, my father thought this was one of the people who thought this would all go away after a year or two, but he was wrong. And by this time, it was almost impossible to get out of Europe if you were Jewish. I want to show this one picture. This four. It's on the screen. Okay, thank you. Those two girls were shot.
The two on the right.
So my parents were desperate now because staying in Austria probably meant you were going to die. But luckily, they knew someone who was a Quaker. And found out that the Quakers in Sweden were taking in children. And so they decided that they weren't going to get out, to send my sister and I, at this time I was about 9 or 10, to Sweden. And we did go to Sweden, and my mother took us on the train halfway, and then someone in Sweden took us further. And while all these things were happening in Germany and in Europe, we were in Sweden for about 2 years, and it was wonderful. Never missed a meal. There are a lot of pictures, but I just brought one. This is us skiing to school. It was a wonderful place, and the people were good. People often ask, how did I feel without my parents? And my answer is, I don't know. I think about it, but I can't remember thinking about them. They sort of went into the background, and I was having too good of a time. But what happened in Sweden, while we were there, two things happened. One, my parents were fortunate enough to get out of Europe, and they went to the United States while we were in Sweden. So after we were in Sweden for a while, maybe another 6 months, the Germans invaded 2 countries in Scandinavia. There's 3. There's Sweden, there's Norway, and there's Denmark. And they went into, not Sweden, but they went into Denmark and into Norway and started the same kind of extermination of Jews there. They were not as successful there because the local population did a very good job of hiding the people and taking them into Sweden. But the problem for the people who were watching us, and this was an older couple, they were about in their 60s, I would guess now. Though then I was young, and everybody who wasn't young looked old, so I don't know about that. But they were very, very nice, and their family was nice. I was thinking the other day, when I was preparing for this, was there anything that happened in Sweden that I would say was bad or annoyed me or scared me? Only one thing. The way they taught you how to swim, they threw you off a dock. Into cold water. I was really scared, but I swam. Here, when my kids were young, teaching them swimming cost me $100. By every week, they extended the swimming with another toe in the water. And I learned how to swim. In one day. But the problem in Sweden came when the Germans invaded Norway and Denmark, because everyone expected that they would next invade Sweden, which they did not. And the people in Sweden now were faced with a situation where, what do you do with these 2 kids? the idea was to have us spend the war there, and it was fairly obvious eventually, after all the bad things they did, the Germans would lose the war, because Hitler was just a madman, and his idea of war, and fortunately, was terrible. He sent his troops into actions and battles that couldn't be won, etc., etc. And their effort to kill the Jews took over so much of the war effort, not the major part, but enough that it interfered with running your war. But that's another story. So then the people in Sweden were faced with sending us out of Sweden to the United States. The only problem with that is crossing the Atlantic was extremely dangerous. Ships were being sunk left and right. So making that voyage was not something to look forward to. And actually, the people who were taking care of us that we lived with, their son was killed in his Swedish ship was torpedoed. So this was a real problem. So the other way of getting to the United States meant going around the world the other way, 3/4 of the way. Instead of going across across the Atlantic, we went, the plan was to send us through Latvia and Russia and Siberia and Manchuria and Japan and across the Atlantic and across the United States. So now I just thought today, who made the decision to send us that way? And the answer is, I don't know. If my parents were involved in this or anyone else was involved. Well, obviously people planned it, I'll tell you that in a minute. But I don't know if my parents said, go this way, that way. They really were in New York, they were living on charity, and they had no way of making any decisions about this. So someone decided the safer way is to go the long way. This also meant raising money to do this. So the people in Sweden raised the money, and they arranged a trip. Now, this trip took 2 months because of waiting for transportation. So we took a plane from Sweden to Moscow, and stopped in Latvia, and then we took this train across Siberia. If you ever see a map and see the size of Siberia, it was an 8-day trip. And then we took a boat from Russia to Japan, and then crossed Japan, which is a short distance, to the other side of Japan. And we took another boat, which there's a picture of, and doesn't really say too much, to the United States. Now, who was in charge of this group of people? It was a group, it was a strange group, and it was organized again by the Swedish authorities. I was 10 and my sister is a year younger, but now she tells people she's much younger, but that's something else. So they assigned this group. I'm not sure, I know how it was made up, but it was very strange. A lot of people were Jewish, it was about 20 people. Others were from other countries who had to get out of their countries. And the group left together, and they assigned a 17-year-old girl to be our chaperone. I can't remember details of the trip, but it was a great trip. So all along the way, I got to New York, and I went through this terrible war, and that's why I'm here today. A lot of people didn't make it. And the reason I'm here today, my grandson lives here, and I was asked to speak, so I came down here. Good reason, and two important reasons to speak and to see him. You can stand up for a minute.
Mr. Alex. Hello to everybody.
He got out of school today to come here, so he's happy. What school do you go to?
Fontainebleau Junior
A
High.
little louder, I can't.
Fontainebleau Junior High.
Oh, okay. I hope you heard that.
Ladies.
And his mother, Ashley.
Hi.
And why this all came about is because somebody painted swastikas on the synagogue. Now, I was going to give another page here about that, but I decided, I said to myself, Karl, I call myself by my first name, we're very close, and said that if I, after this talk, have to give a talk why you shouldn't paint swastikas on synagogues, my whole talk failed. And I don't like to fail. So I decided it's silly to talk about why you shouldn't do that. And that really is the story of my trip. I thought I'd read you one thing here, which I have, which sort of sums it up. And then I'll answer any question that you have. And this comes from a play on Broadway, South Pacific, a musical, act play. You've got to be taught to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be taught. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to hate all the people you relatively hate by 6 or 7 or 8, or it's too late to teach hate. And then I understand that Ruby Bridges came when the synagogue was desecrated. And what she said, and what made me think of that, those words, hate is an adult disease. So I'm going to stop there. I'll answer any questions you have. Anyone have any questions you want to ask?
I do. When you first heard of the synagogue being desecrated, we're talking about the Mandeville
Yes.
Synagogue. Does anybody not know what I'm talking about? Synagogue desecration. Anybody? It's okay. Doesn't make you an idiot. So can you Google Mandeville Synagogue desecration? Yeah. Does everybody know where the synagogue is in Mandeville? Mm-hmm. You know where George's is in Mandeville on 190 right now, right? It's right next to George's. Okay, good. And we've got some geography. About 2 months ago, someone, we still don't know who, went behind the synagogue and spray painted swastikas, which are the Nazi, the symbol of Nazism, with some pretty rough language. There you go. Isn't that big and pretty? There it is. Can you? I don't know how well you can see this. This is the Nazi swastika here and here. They painted Synagogue of Satan, misspelling synagogue. Then the word burn, misspelled the word burn. In 1488, we talked about this in my class, and of course they put a Christian crucifix there with 1488. In my class we talked about what some of the symbols mean, but the thing that upset, I know you, upset me, upset a lot of people is this is not something we normally see here. I just found out 2 days ago that hate crimes, that are crimes directed against people because of their ethnicity, because of their religion, because of their sex, is highest in Louisiana. Can you guess where in Louisiana?
South Louisiana?
St. Tammany Parish, right here. St. Tammany Parish. Now you would think, oh, it would be, you know, in Bunkie, Louisiana, or someplace out in the sticks. No, it's right here. This kind of thing does not normally happen. We don't hear about it. It's the little things that they count as hate crimes. This certainly does count as a hate crime. I'm happy to tell you that this was painted over, and the children at the synagogue have made a mural out of this. And it's very nice. But what I wanted to ask you, Doctor, is this. When you see this, when you hear about Pittsburgh, when you see things like that, does it dishearten you? Does it make you angry, sad? How do you feel?
All those things plus numb. You can't believe it.
Is it something that you personally worry about? As a Jew, is it something that you worry about going through your day-to-day life, or maybe going to the synagogue or something? Is it something you worry about? Because I'll tell you right now, in this building right now, as a Catholic, I don't feel endangered. I don't feel worried. And I think most of these people in here who are to one degree or another Christian, I don't think they worry about when they go to their services on a Sunday. I don't think they worry about it. Do you worry about that kind of stuff?
Well, I'm beginning to. This country has been wonderful. One of the things I was going to bring, but I forgot it in New York, was my citizenship paper, which I got when I was 14. And the goal of people in Europe in the days of the Holocaust was to come to America. And because you didn't worry about that. And if something happened, the authorities would protect you. At the synagogue now, when they have services, there's a policeman.
Does anybody else go to church on Sunday and have a cop outside your church?
So they have a policeman station. And in New York, after the Pittsburgh episode, they also had police station. But I don't feel that, you know, that this is something that is that prevalent in the U.S. But times change, and crimes of this kind are on the upswing all over the country. It is worrisome. You know, one saying that I remember from being when I was in Germany, a lady who told me that her family were perpetrators. Two things she said. It doesn't take much to make a everyday citizen into a murderer. And the other thing she said that I remember is that when people started doing things against the Jews, nobody cared. You know, a minor thing, they'll blow over, they deserve it, this and that. By the time they were shooting little girls as enemies of the state, no one could do anything, because it meant certain death. And in a way, other people, it's a slippery slope. Once you're on that slope of painting swastikas anywhere, knowing it's hateful, totally hateful. No redeeming reason to do that. You can worry about it. I can slide into these things without realizing what is happening. Any other questions? Yes?
Is your sister still alive?
I'm sorry, could you stand up, please? My hearing is not what it used to be.
Is your sister still alive?
I'm sorry?
Is your sister still alive?
Yes. She's still alive. I see her very frequently. She lives right near us. Yes.
Have you ever visited your hometown in Austria, or like gone back to Switzerland even?
Sweden.
I have gone back to Austria. A couple of relatives survived the war, very few, most were killed. And very interesting. when I first went back after the war, I was very uncomfortable. And I really had trouble. But over the years, the equation changed. And when I went back, well now, you know, it's a while ago, they were uncomfortable with me. I speak German with an accent. They know exactly who I am, where I was. And I do think the younger generation ask, how could this have happened? And I believe they believe that. Any other questions? Oh, I'm sorry.
It's like being a Holocaust survivor and having to go through all that, something that affects you like your daily life today.
No, I don't think it affects my daily life today. You know, people wonder how these things affect you psychologically. I have a couple of friends who are psychiatrists. They always ask me, how did you feel in those days? And I say, I just didn't feel it. And they say you shut out your feelings or whatever. So I came through this terrible situation, I think, pretty well intact. So I would say what I did today here, in my 87 years in this world, was by far the most emotional thing I've ever done. I mean, have you ever seen me like this?
Never. No.
I give humorous talks to people. So this is very unusual. I think it was very good for me, a catharsis.
Aw.
Can I add on? You told me shortly before you spoke, you've never talked about this to any group
No,
before. Never.
no. I have never talked to any group like this before. This was my first episode of speaking, and I'm so happy for your invitation, Mr. Harvey.
Why do you think this is so, I know the answer, but I want you to say it. Why do you think this is so emotional for you and difficult to talk about? And I noticed the different things that you paused at that were very emotional for you. But one of the questions I know I'm going to be asked tomorrow is, why did you get upset about this, that, or the other?
The first answer would be, if you know, tell me.
I think it personally connects to you.
Oh, obviously. But making me this emotional, who's not emotional at all. I think you're right. I brought out things that I don't see every day or think about every day. And never put together like I did today. I mean, everything I said today I knew about before, but I never put it on a piece of paper and had to read it. So that's why I'm that emotional. Hopefully, if I do this again, I will not be so emotional. And this talk will take half the time. So that's, you know, it's just a terrible event. And when people do things, I feel numb. I don't know how to react. I can't believe that this is happening. But these things happen, you gotta be realistic.
How do you feel when you hear stuff like that in the news, Pittsburgh in the news? This is going to be personal something, but I'm going to ask it anyway in this room. How does it affect your faith?
I'm sorry?
How does going through what you went through affect your faith? And then when you hear about what's going on in Pittsburgh and Mandeville, stuff like that, anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic acts, how does it affect your faith?
You know, that's a very good question. And again, it's something I haven't really put together, but it has come up in my mind. That really, realistically, you question God. But then I realized I send my grandson, and I don't send but his parents send him to synagogue, and that makes me happy. That you have to keep faith, and you have to keep the religion going. And the amazing thing about the Jewish religion, as I'm sure Mr. Hardy knows, that it's still around after all these centuries, and doing reasonably well. That people will go to synagogue, even though somebody may shoot it up. Any other questions? These were, yes?
When you first came to the United States, and you said your last year of education, in Austria, did you pick it back up in the United States, and was it difficult?
Not really. You know, good question. Good questions are questions that I can answer. They always say, the radio, TV question, and then they say, that's a good question. But these are good questions that I can answer. When I came to this country, I spoke, that's an interesting anecdote. When we came to New York, and our parents met us at Grand Central Station, we spoke Swedish.
Wow.
So we could understand some German, but it was 2 years, and kids learn languages very quickly and forget them very quickly, but they come back quickly. So we could not really communicate.
Oh, wow.
Which was worse, I think, for our parents than for us. And what they did in those days, which I think is the best way to make you learn a language, they put us into only English-speaking classes. They didn't use the system now, which has some value, I'm sure, of teaching people in English as a second language. So here I am, and they put me, by then I was 10 or 11, I guess. When I got here, I was 10. I was put in first grade. And after a few months, they put me into second grade, third grade. And I think by 6 months, I spoke English well enough to reach my grade level. So that's what happened with the language. I can understand Swedish now, and I can speak German because when we were living in New York, my parents didn't speak English. They spoke German, so they learned English, but the only way to commute was German. Those days I didn't want to speak German. Now I wish I had kept up my German to speak it better than I do. Okay, any other questions?
When they took away your house or when you left, what happened to all that property? Your bank accounts, your personal property?
It disappeared.
I mean, you go back after the war, knock on the front door and say, okay, we're back to our house?
Well, that's another interesting point. I did go back, and I went to the house, and the people were not that friendly, because I think they thought that I would make a claim or something, which I didn't. But it was all stolen. It was taken over, and people who survived and came back didn't have their property anymore. And the house was still there, still over the street, and the people were very suspicious of me, but they showed me around. So all the property was stolen, or possessed, as they said.
Repossessed.
All right, well, thank you very much for listening. It's my pleasure to give this talk.
Thank you.